Okay, this is the video lecture for Chapter 6 in our Intro to Politics class. This is on justice and social needs. Now keep in mind, when we say justice, we're not necessarily talking just about punishment. We're talking about how a society treats its people with respect to fairness and consistency, and with what kind of rights that it provides for its citizens. We've got two types of definitions for justice. We have a substantive justice, which has to do with what people need and deserve, and what society or its decision makers determines what we need and deserve. And then procedural justice, as you can imagine, focuses on the due process of justice, which everybody would want to be dispensed fairly and perhaps somewhat unbiased, that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about three major things here. Are government actions arbitrary? Are basic rights being violated? Are there any special overriding social needs with respect to justice as far as trade-offs with rights versus needs? So how do we prevent justice from being dispensed arbitrarily? Now what that means is just through some whims of somebody in power that doesn't like the way you look, or doesn't like your group of people, or is basing their decisions on beliefs or generational hatreds and things like that. So what we have here, particularly in a democratic system such as the United States, is the due process that's established in our Constitution. The Fifth Amendment implies that we have due process of law. In the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. So we have a certain amount of standardization that everybody has to comply with in order to take that arbitrariness out of the system, and we follow the rules and we dispense justice. Also, it requires some amount of knowledgeable society. People need to know that a law exists, what a law means, how and what crimes they are charged with, and what their process that they are entitled to. Another thing that we have to deal with are judges, unbiased or not. And we do know that judges are human beings, and they could be driven by political ideologies or beliefs, and some of that is inevitable. But of course, they also have to comply with standard rules of law. And we also know that in our justice system that we have a means for an appeal. If in many cases, regardless of what your verdict is, you have the opportunity. Of course, there could be some limitations and restrictions to that, but the opportunity exists for your trial to be, or your charges to be reconsidered. And clearly, if some rules were violated in that process, the trial could be determined invalid, and therefore you are given another trial. So these are some of the things that we do to try to prevent justice from just being dispensed arbitrarily. We also see that there are some basic rights that seem to be common to any democratic type of system, that a lot of other rights seem to derive from this. Obviously, the right to survive, to be able to live, and we can even translate that into being able to live without fear, or to live comfortably, or to live with the certain things that we need to live comfortably, certain privileges or opportunities. Right to free speech is a very basic right, which even translates to things as freedom of worshiping like you want, or freedom of the press to question authority, to right to assemble. So the free speech is kind of at the foundation of a democratic society, and clearly there's restrictions to that as well. You can't. There's some things that you just simply can't do. For example, lie under oath, or to scream fire in a crowded theater that creates a stampede that tramples 3 children to death. Certainly, there's some things that you can't do with, or even maliciously impugning somebody's reputation to where it hurts their ability to make a living. So again, restrictions with these rights that we have to consider. And of course, the right to privacy is a very fundamental right that is at the root of a lot of ours, such as having to have warrants to search, and certain other rights as far as not having to incriminate yourself, your rights to silence and things like that. And as we get into more interactive society, just where we are immersed in social media, there are other things that we're dealing with. In fact, the Supreme Court recently ruled that you have to have a search warrant to search somebody's cell phone because we have so much of our lives on our cell phone. Of course, we have to keep in mind that these rights are not absolute, but a top priority in our system. As we get more and more immersed in social media, we could be violating our own privacy by putting ourselves out there, regardless of what a government agency like the NSA might be doing in order to try to keep tabs on people to stop terrorism. And in fact, the Supreme Court even ruled the NSA's surveillance practices as illegal, so they had to regroup as to what they were doing. So we're getting a very complex world with respect to privacy and then other issues, whether it's surveillance to prevent terrorism, things like that. Now, the United States Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. Now, I'm not going to go over these in detail. We'll actually talk about these again in a later chapter, but I wanted to make these aware to you. I'm going to want you to read the Constitution and these Bill of Rights and start to kind of assess what kind of rights that we have in the United States. But in addition, there's a lot of things that could be considered rights that we kind of take for granted. So I want you to read the Bill of Rights, which is part of the Constitution. So read the Constitution, it's relatively short. Now, what are the social needs that could be trade-offs with our rights? For example, if we're at war, lots of things can happen during a war. We could require a draft where people are obligated to sign up for the military to fight this war. If there's a lot of racism or discrimination that's still prevalent in the society, a program such as affirmative action may require companies to have more equal hiring practices. Or if we have segregation that's promoting inequality or lack of opportunity or even discrimination, then the government may require desegregation efforts or integration efforts. And we've seen these in our history. The being in war itself has resulted in internment camps, such as the internment of the Japanese during World War II. Even the war with Iraq, we had some prison camps where even some of the prisoners' rights were determined to be violated. The push for anti-terrorism tactics could be potentially obtrusive on our privacy, as well as the surveillance to try to prevent terrorism that I just mentioned earlier. So these are all trade-offs with social needs that we may have to sacrifice a little bit of rights, or if those social needs become to where our rights may be getting violated, for example, lack of privacy, then we'll push back on those social needs and policies could change. We do know that in any country, even today, revolutions would suspend due process in order to try to get stability back into your country. And the Civil War in the United States back in the 1860s is a prime example where President Lincoln literally declared martial law. He suspended the right of habeas corpus, which we've touched on a little bit before. The right of habeas corpus means that you are entitled to this due process of being brought before a court, addressed the charges, able to post bail, able to bring witnesses, able to actually assist with your defense. And that, in many cases, goes out the window during a rebellion or revolution in order for the leaders to try to restore order and mend this conflict. So this is where you've got to look at some of these alternatives. Now, the ends, even though we may agree on the end goal, doesn't necessarily justify the means in order to violate people's rights. Clearly, there are some means that are justified to get to a certain end that everybody appears to agree on. But then, of course, that's what makes politics difficult, is that we have to collectively decide on how we're going to achieve that end result. And are the means too obtrusive? Are they violating people's rights? So what we come down to when we're looking at justice versus social needs, that there's always some mixture of contribution of those needs, the needs themselves, the equality that is kind of at the root of any democratic society, to try to at least promote the equality of opportunity, even though equality itself may not ever be perfectly realized. So what we have here is some interesting trade-offs. Now, how is justice effective? Well, you could argue that we're trying to get the greatest benefit for the least cost. And again, when I'm talking about justice here, I'm talking about providing for your people what your people need fairly and consistently. And this benefit may be difficult to measure, as are the costs, as far as trying to have some sort of effective justice. Now, another thing that we have to deal with when we're making decisions or dispensing justice or creating policies that help people, well, we can have some unanticipated consequences. These are always, you have to think these things out before you come up with a policy. And sometimes we don't think of these, and they end up being not as effective, or they could create more costs than what we thought they were going to entail. For example, the book talks about some interesting examples here. Green energy policies. For example, if a country subsidizes solar energy panels, well, that could divert solar energy production to a country that has less sunlight. So therefore, if a country that actually has more sunlight is not promoting that, then we're actually being inefficient in our green energy policies. Whereas that well-meant policy to try to subsidize solar power is actually making it worse by diverting resources to a country that has less sunlight than a country that has more sunlight that could really benefit from that. Illegal immigration is a controversial issue now, in that where certain policies may be promoting more strict enforcement or bigger and higher walls to keep out illegal immigrants. And regardless of any judgment of what policies are good, bad, right, or wrong, we do know that there could be unanticipated consequences for stricter enforcement. And we do know that if walls got higher and thicker, well, then the illegal immigrants that are in the country would have a tendency to stay longer, because they know that they might not be able to get back in. Whereas we do know one of the biggest deterrents to illegal immigration is recession. If the economy has a downturn, we see that illegal immigrants have less opportunity and they go back to where their home country is. And so that would be an anticipated consequence of stricter border enforcement policies, because it could entice immigrants to stay longer and be even perhaps more of a greater social cost, because they may not have the jobs, but they're finding out ways to stay. Now, as far as our social insurance programs, social welfare programs, the book talks about some interesting side effects there. Social Security is the program biggest expense in our federal government, whereas you get to hit 65, you qualify for social insurance to help meet your needs as you grow older, whereas you retire not working. And we do see that since there's a cap on Social Security uh, as far as deductions go, or taking out of your check, so to speak, that there's a cap on that. So therefore, lower income people are effectively taxed more in the long run. We also see that Social Security systems, which are fairly common and standard throughout modern democracies, it does promote less ties with family, whereas before families were more obligated to take care of their elderly family members, and now there's more of a separation there. Again, that's an effect of changing and shifting norms more so than anything else, with as well as the incentives to for elderly people to live on their own. And there's also a standard age of retirement, which means that some people feel like, well, why should I be obligated to retire at this age? I want to work. I want to keep working for years and years and years. Whereas other people may say, yeah, I can't wait to retire. So again, a standard age of retirement has some side effects that may be unanticipated. As far as the welfare system, which does seem to get a lot of criticism, well, there's several welfare programs to assist people that are out of work or victims of a recession or an economic downturn. And that helps keep people afloat until they can get a job, and or if they're on disability, things like that. And we do see that there's a potential for people to be dependent on these welfare payments, and then therefore may be less incentivized to go look for work when they can get this money without working. So we have some dependency issues. We also are wondering at times as whether or not these welfare payments are getting to help the children, whereas the parents may be spending it on other things. And we do know there's a considerable amount of fraud, not just in the welfare system, but even in the healthcare system, whereas a huge chunk, as much as 1/5 of the expense of Medicare has been related to fraud. But we also see considerable amount of fraud in welfare, is particularly such as disability, where people are claiming a disability that could actually work. So we've got side effects that we have to deal with all of our policies that are trying to dispense fairness and consistency throughout the system. Now let's talk just for a few minutes about authority-based policy versus market-based policy. And again, in a complex society like the United States, you've got a mixture of the two. But what we'll look at is that if you focus more on authority, i.e. state-based policy, what are some pros and cons of that? Or if you focus more on a market-based policy, which tries to get the state out of the way of the decision making, we may have even more externalities there. Now, with the authority-based policy, a state, as we've seen, is not typically good at getting things to those who need or value them most. We have to have people to apply and qualify for numerous things, and we've also seen with communism, the state does not always allocate things optimally. The market enables the resources to go where they're needed the most, whereas a state that's trying to plan ahead for 10 years may get that way off the mark. And that is part of the reason why those systems has failed. It is part of the reason why the market systems have succeeded due to their flexibility and adaptability. We also see that the state may have a lack of incentives to use resources as efficiently as it could. They are not specifically getting a benefit or rewarded for making a good decision. And for example, a state official, particularly if you don't want them to be corrupt, they would not personally gain from a wise decision. They would still be getting their government salary, so that could detract from an incentive to make a good decision if you don't get a benefit or a bonus from it, right? So that's a very interesting aspect of a fair and consistent government. They have to make good decisions for all of the people, but of course we don't want them to be corrupt to in doing that. And there may not be as informed or, like I said, incentivized to make efficient decisions. Now, as far as market-based policy, if we lean heavily towards that, it means we're trying to get the state out of the picture, and we see immediate problems with that because the market-based policy is very much blind to inequality. Blind to equality and fairness. Markets tend to go what's most efficient, what people need, and where the resources need to go. People can exploit the market in order to try to meet those needs and get profit. So what we've seen, just as we've seen already with capitalism, that with market-based policy, wealth and income are not distributed equally. And in order to alleviate that, you're going to need some sort of regulation or state intervention, some sort of monitoring to try to get it from becoming dysfunctionally unequal. Also, with market-based policy, the ability to pay enters along with the need. Somebody that may need it may not be able to afford it. Typical example of that is that the Sixth Amendment to the Constitution says that you have right to counsel. Okay, that's great, but for a long time, what if you said, okay, I would like to have that right, but I can't afford counsel? Well, then back in the 60s, the Supreme Court ruled that if you could not afford one, then the state is obligated to provide that for you. So that kind of went hand in hand with this, with effective or fair justice. Is that, well, what good is the right to counsel if you can't afford it? So then the state took that extra step to require that to be provided. So again, market-based policy is not going to be concerned with fairness or equality. We also know that market-based policy is not effective in producing public goods. We have tried to privatize education, but then of course that would mean that we could have a more stratified society, that only the people that could afford education would be getting it. So therefore we would have an intellectual divide as well as an economic divide. We also know that on a local level, that if you had a totally privatized fire department, you would call the fire department and they say, well, how much money you got before we come put out your fire? And then you'd call around trying to get the cheapest price, and by that time your house is burned down. So again, you've got some public goods that really are not conducive to making a profit, and so the market would not really apply to producing those goods. So yet another difficulty with market-based policy. Now, social costs are pretty much taken literally costs to society. These are often called externalities because these can be a result of these unanticipated consequences or any type of issue or problem that we're dealing with in society. What is it costing society in terms of even deaths or destruction or life inconveniences? So we know that if a corporation is focused only on profit, well, then they would potentially ignore pollution. And so that would be an externality that a market, or that a corporation really has no incentive to cleaning up or stopping unless they were forced to do that. Because if they're trying to maximize their profit, which corporations are very rational creatures, well, then they would either ignore or try to minimize their attention to pollution. Once again, if you have a market-driven education system, well, then the social cost of ignorance could get greater because people that can't afford schooling would not get schooling, and so therefore you would have a dysfunctional amount of ignorance. In addition, if poor health is an interesting situation because in the United States, healthcare is really not considered a public good. It's still based on the ability to pay, and we've seen some considerable consequences from that as as the lower income population, which is getting larger in America, is unable to afford uh, more nutritional food, unable to afford health care, unable to afford health insurance, and we've seen that those are skewing our results as far as the health of our society. We've already talked about how how the United States is comparing in some of these things, and so therefore we've got some externalities there of market-based policy that would have to be considered. The book talks about some examples of political choice. These would be interesting to follow up on. For example, looking at need-based scholarships, what are the consequences there? That if you provide scholarships for people based on need, well, what's going to happen if just because they get a scholarship because they need the money? Well, what does that have to do with finishing college? We may have a lot of government expense provided to students to go to college, but yet they may quit and drop out after a year or two. So that becomes expensive in a way that is not taking into account perhaps the the ability perhaps to finish college, right? Not just need based. Water pollution, lots of questions there. What do we have to ban? What we have to decide? What is pollution and who's going to bear that cost? Are the taxpayers going to bear that cost? Is the industry going to bear that cost? Is that particular firm going to bear that cost? How are we going to incentivize them to not pollute? Are we just going to give them penalties or banning it totally or make some economic cost for that? The book also talks about considering children as public goods. Whereas in some societies, such as Japan, Russia, and Italy, they have a negative population growth. And we've talked about if your population is negatively in the negative growth phase, then your dependency ratio is going to get smaller, and you're going to have some pretty critical economic factors to where you're going to have fewer people that are working that have to pay for more people that aren't working. So if we incentivize families to have children and treat them like public goods, where the government finances the raising or producing and raising of children, it's an interesting concept, but you could have some externalities there. For example, would the government subsidize just poor families or all families in general that were willing to raise children? And of course, we already see some externalities or unintended consequences here. Is that could that just incentivize the government for to pay for children? And so we got some interesting things there with respect to to justice and social needs. All right, now the class exercise, I'll be posting this again later. What I want you to do, in this course, everybody is required to participate in the class exercise. I want you to read the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, and start thinking about it. Brainstorm this. Are there any additional rights do you think that could be added to our Constitution? Are there rights that seem to be coming into the limelight that we might want to focus on, and it would be worthwhile making an amendment to add that right to the Constitution? This could be something that we have taken for granted for a long time, and maybe it needs to be expressed, because there are other countries in the world that have lots of rights that they want to have them put in their Constitution, and these are the types of rights that we would literally take for granted, that we wouldn't even think that would be necessary to put in our Constitution. But that would be an interesting discussion to have. Now, as far as preparing for the quiz for Chapter 6, how do we prevent justice from being arbitrarily distributed out there in our system? What is a social cost? Give me some examples of social cost. And then what are the concerns with market-based policy?